Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him, and I am part of this amazing community of people who just love talking about the business of making games, whether or not they're actually based in London. I'm going to be delighted to be joined today by a new host, and an additional host is joining us. And I've got Mafalda. Mafalda, how are you doing? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Mafalda Duarte. I'm from Lisbon. I actually founded Game Dev Lisbon with some friends, and now Game Dev London took me away. I'm here. I'm here as a host for the first time. Super excited to connect with all of you, and yeah, let's kick this off.
Well, I mean, it's still GDL, so that still works, doesn't it? So,
Yeah.
well, we've known each other for a little while, and I've seen you in all sorts of circumstances, conferences, and events. So we thought we'd have a quick of a chat because I'm on this Podquest. I'm on this journey to learn everything you want to know about game dev, but never dare to ask. So let's talk about what it's like making games in different places. Obviously, here we are in London. We've got 30, 40 years of heritage of making games, because basically that's as long as there have been video games. You could argue maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit. But I've been doing this for 24 years, would you believe? And I'd started relatively late. And as somebody who's been an evangelist, who's been working on platforms, somebody who's worked with developers, someone who's started from us, I've met a whole bunch of people. I managed to be lucky enough to travel all the world. One of the most interesting places I managed to travel to, of course, was Lisbon, where our mutual good friend Ricardo was helping coordinate an event at the time called Game Dev Camp.
Yeah.
Many years ago. I think you were just saying that it's probably that the first one I went to was maybe 8 years ago or something ridiculous.
I think the Game Dev Camp, if Ricardo invited you, was it at Microsoft? Do you remember
Yes,
that?
it was the Microsoft one. Yeah.
Yeah,
There
I
were
think like
Microsoft ones.
so the first one was in 2014, the second one 2015. So yeah, it started
One of
long
those.
ago.
I think it would have been one of those. Yeah.
So yeah, my first one, I think it was my dedicated to game dev events also. It was the 2014 Game Dev Camp at Microsoft. I was fresh out of art school because I did art multimedia and fine arts. And a friend of mine, he was like, Mafalda, you look like a producer. Like you could produce my game. And so he invited me to join this indie
What
team.
does that mean? You look
Yeah.
like a
Oh,
producer. Oh my
okay.
god.
Oh, I think I never told this part of the story. So, and then a friend of mine, he works at Flavorworks, the studio that
Yeah.
did Erica. Yeah. Um, so he's in London now. Hi. And so Antonio, we were at a funeral, and he was like, oh. So now I'm doing an internship in Ricardo's company back then by Biodroid, and he was like, I'm doing an internship in game design now, and I'm also in my free time joining all these people. We're doing like an indie studio kind of thing. I have like 3 projects in place, but there's this one project I really believe, and I think you know how to deal with projects, and I know nothing about games back then. So yeah, I just went home. I went to like a bookshop. I bought a book called like Game Design and Development, and I read the intro and all of that, and that's how I got in.
Yeah, I have to admit, I mean, as I say, we met many times, and you do have that kind of get shit done type of mentality, which I think that if anyone's going to say what is it about somebody that defines a producer, I think I was Lucy, a friend of mine, we were doing a chat about what is a producer anyway? What do they do anyway?
Yeah.
Which is the common joke that I like to play on producers, which is very mean because a lot of people don't understand what producers do and why they're so important. So I like to take the mick out of my friends who are producers because they get that in the neck all the time. But I do think there's something like this get stuff done that is really kind of
For sure. I think it's that, and just like having this wanting to solve problems all the time. It's just like that's just how the default works in me. It's just like, okay, we have this, how can we figure it out? And in Game Dev Camp was like one of the first time I met like real producers that worked in games, and I went to the talks and I was like all excited and geeky, like, oh, these are all the people in Portugal. And it was like a big event for Portugal back then. It's like, I think it was like 200 people.
Yeah, about 200 people, as I remember. I found there was some really interesting. There's a kind of they had a section near the entrance, as I remember, where they had a whole bunch of tables of people showing off the games, and I think Ricardo was showing off something from the Biodroid guys because he'd actually
Summer,
had
the surf game, maybe.
Yes, I think it was. Yeah. And because he had me going to the studio at that point as well to talk to their team, but because I managed to do all of this at once. Obviously, the only reason I was there was because of the pastel de nata, but that's another subject.
Yeah, that's how you get people in. You're like, but like we have pastel de nata
on the planet, just really.
I need to brought one with me next time we do a podcast together.
Yeah,
I'll just eat it while you talk. I'm like, so good.
Sure. But the interesting thing for me was that I find this. I mean, I've seen similar things in many countries. When I went to Brazil, when I went into Poland, when I went to Ljubljana, various other places. All sorts of places. There are some places that have an established kind of heritage of game making, and there are others that are trying to learn and find their feet, and both are really interesting for different reasons. What I find is that you often find the people who've got the established space will often have a quite high level in terms of the kind of like production quality, production values, but don't always have the same level of creativity. Whereas a lot of this is a very generic way. I'm not saying everywhere is like this, but I often find that you get these nuggets of like this really, if you don't know what you don't know, you often find this moment of gameplay that I hadn't seen before. And that often comes out of those studios. Now, don't get me wrong, they're not always very well implemented. They're not always very well done, but it shows to me this hunger and desire to tell stories or to create experiences through gameplay.
Yeah, I think
it's very common.
I agree with you a lot, especially so when I go to at BIG, for example, I had the opportunity to go in the digital editions, and whenever I'm talking to Brazilian developers, and even in my class, I did a master's degree in game development. With like half my class was like Brazilian people that came to Portugal to study, and they brought that energy of like doing a lot of like heritage type of folk tales like into their games, or like a different type of like a kind of naivete in the way of thinking games. There's like simpler sometimes mechanics. They're not like as deep thought out, but wanting to tell very specific things. And that's not like it's not that there doesn't exist other things. It's just there is this like indie mentality that sometimes can be any hindrance to the industry, because then people are not understanding the different types of routes that they can go to and managing their portfolios accordingly. But like the upside is that naivete that sometimes is like, oh, I'm going to venture in this thing that it is not going to work in the current market, but maybe will open some doors for future things. So I agree with you.
I think don't get me wrong, there are lots of issues quite often, particularly in those undeveloped territories, in terms of game design, obviously not undeveloped in general, but in that they don't necessarily get the commercial realities of what games mean and what standards are needed, the production values required to get to the point where you can have a retelling success for developers. But game dev isn't just about the money as much as I wear a top hat and talk about the money.
I think that's one of the cool parts about going around the world, and especially interact with, again, emergent markets, is just they're not yet thinking about game as the product and as a business. But I just want to make games side of it,
I just
right?
want to make games. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that's a really kind of common theme. Is one of the other issues I think, which we see with people who are starting out in game dev, regardless of where they're from, we often find them starting with a game that they want to play, rather than how they would make a game for a specific audience of players.
Oh, but you know what? I think, and and hear me out. I'm going to be controversial, but it's I think in a way it's just part of like this mentality of hiring like gamers as game makers. Because, for example, I identify as a game maker first and a gamer second, very second. Because there's games that I play all the time, like. I will just have TFT open all the time just while I'm doing other things. But I don't take too much enjoyment of having like an entire afternoon behind the controller, you know, like I get tired of it. And again, I'm not saying everyone needs to be like that, but I could be the entire afternoon just thinking about ways like how to solve systems and game design ideas and aesthetics and how this is going to work in the game and how can I solve this problem. And so I also think there's like this obsession in like, oh, are you a gamer? How many hours do you have in WoW? Or that was a thing that happened in the industry in a few years back. And I think starting to open more the doors for game making as an industry, as something that is a career that is skill oriented and not just like you're a player. I think you need to be a lover of games.
You said you're going to be controversial. That sounds perfectly reasonable. That
but there's a lot of people that would say, yeah, but if you don't play games, like how can you make them?
I mean, don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
I am. You cut me, I bleed. Game, regardless. And although I have to say, I've got old, and therefore, rather than the first-person shooters, which is what I got me really excited about games in the first place. I fell in love with 3D. I fell in love with first-person shooters. I ended up helping run one of the first online gaming platforms back in the day, like 98, would you believe? So I was sitting there doing it, but I've always had a bit of dyspraxia, so I've never been the best at it. And also I'm older. You can't as an older guy with a bit of dyspraxia, you cannot compete with.
Yeah.
You know, I just remember headshot dead. That's my experience now. So I've become, even though I'm a massive fanatical fan and evangelist for multiplayer games, I find myself playing massively single player.
Yeah.
That means I find games where I don't have to be talking to anyone. Even though I'm a massive extrovert, I find myself sitting there.
Okay, we need to do an episode about this issue because it's like I'm like you, as you know, but I hate to play games with others. Like I love to play multiplayer games where I can be alone, like Minecraft but alone, like WoW but alone, like everything. I give up to playing online multiplayer games as soon as they are like, oh, to progress you need to have a party and you need to do these dungeons, and I'm like, well, no, I stopped playing then.
And again, so the reason for saying all that is because I think when we talk about this, we're actually quite passionate about games.
Yeah.
And when people are saying, but if you're not gaming, what they're actually saying is, are you passionate about games? Because I think there is something truthful about the art of games, about games are an expression of creativity. And let's face it, I often make this comment, basically, making games is the second worst thing in the world because you've got to combine science, technology, art, math, storytelling, music, audio effects, video effects, all in one piece, in alignment, in consistency, to an audience who may or may not like that.
And
but
also,
if you're not making games, sorry.
I was just going to say that to all of that you just described, it's like it's just about experience afterwards. It's like, okay, you can have like theory about all of this, but then it's like every people will experience things differently, and you need to find the people that are in tune with the type of thing that you're trying to create. I think that's one of the most difficult things, right? It's so whenever I'm talking to students, it's just they're like, for example, oh, I don't want to be a game designer because like a game designer is like something's like a programmer that decides things in the game. Oh, that's totally not true. It's more, and it depends on the studio, depends on a bunch of things, but it's a lot more about the person that knows how to get feedback from others and figure out what feels good to others, right? Because you need to see others play, have that user experience input, put it back, iterate, etc. And I would just say that that element is the element that is really hard to translate to other people, and to put everyone in the same place, right? Because it's like, oh, I want the player to experience this, and then you play, it's like, oh, I'm not experiencing that. Well, how do I do that?
But that to me is kind of bringing it back to the kind of the developer scene. I think that's one of the things we often see in underdeveloped game developer scenes, is that awareness that actually it's a lot easier to work out what that audience you're trying to target wants than it is to try to find an audience for the thing that you've made. So if you make a game just for yourself, well, that's got an audience of one.
Yeah.
But there might be other people like yourself, so then maybe there's more, but you've now got to find those people.
You need to know how to communicate with them and how to find them.
Precisely. Whereas if you kind of know that there is a segment of people that you can address and that they like this kind of content, and then you build something which is your version of that kind of content, that is often an easier kind of approach for, not easier, but that is a more effective way to make sure you have a kind of marketable product.
Yeah, I think that's a way that can be quantifiable as well, because that's the other part, right? So for example, whenever I try to we started doing the short games collection under Monkeys, it's like, okay, we know that there's like this audience for short games. There are like have this finesse that it's not all about bundling them together, like discounting them in a group. It's about like giving like this one experience that is very curated and very artistic in a way. And so and then you have to build that audience, but then not everyone can do that. You cannot keep building your audience from scratch every project you have. You can do that, like you can have like a lover project and you do that, and then you have to have the commercial ones to carry that out. So exactly.
Yeah. So we were just talking about, I mean, obviously events and particularly Game Dev Camp, and I think you've just had another one of those events recently.
Yeah.
So how have things changed in terms of, because obviously when I was there, it was very small and very contained, and not innocent's too strong a word, but there was very. Has that evolved?
Yes and no, in the sense that it has grown over the years, and like I think it was like 400 people, the biggest one that we had. Yeah. But then two things happen. I think when one side is like there's like a limit to where Game Dev Camp can evolve, because it's not made by organization. It's made by volunteers from the Portuguese game community. It passed on from people to it is basically like a duty. So Diogo and Miguel Vicente, like from Microsoft, they started out. The first one, it passed down to Ricardo Flores, to Flippy, etc., and they carry it out. But then, and then it passed on to me and my friends. That we have this group called Ludoteca. We killed that off, started Game Dev Lisbon. But it's like this, essentially the same type of people trying to carry that tradition. And we did that during COVID, the 2 online editions. And so this first physical one, it was meant to. It was smaller in terms of space and scope, and in terms that I couldn't. If you knew my budget, you would laugh. But
I've been there.
It was like essentially zero. But
beg, borrow, steal.
Yeah, but again, it was like an event by the community for the community, so it was important for us that not to let that legacy die. So in that scenario, it's like it's long running but still small, because it's like there's like this threshold that you cannot go through if you don't have like people that are just event organizers, if you don't have like a company behind it, if you don't have an association behind it, if you don't have anyone that is doing that full time. And I think that's a little bit of like the limit. In Portugal at the moment, it's changing more and more, but it's like there's still a difficulty into putting some things in like a commercial level,
Yeah, it's interesting because of course if you look at London, we've got Game Dev, we've got Pocket Gamer, we've got EGX, we've got a whole bunch of things like that. In fact, we've got a couple of the legal firms are doing their own events at the moment to bring game studios in. Now we're talking about probably relatively high level people, but still, and of course you've got BAFTA and various other things. So, and that's just London. If you go beyond that, a lot of the different regional cities, like Guildford has a Guildford game dev days, and there's Norwich is doing one coming up in February. Just been invited to. And even if you go to sort of Sheffield and Leeds, there are sort of really Game Republic guys. Jamie does some amazing stuff in terms of community. I think one of the things we're very lucky at in the UK is that there's a lot of regional support, a lot of regional groups, a lot of heritage of people. And frankly, let's face it, the game scene is relatively small, and we tend to know each other.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found really fascinating is how in the last few years, starting before COVID, there started to be a lot of teams leaving kind of UK and some other territories and going to Lisbon.
Yeah.
Be interesting to sort of know why you think that seems to be happening.
Well, I think we are a good connection point to Europe, first of all. Again, it's like people get first to Portugal and play. And Lisbon just got to be like a hot, sexy town in the past few years. So to live in a bunch of different, especially like for quality of life. We have like, it's not, people always say it's like the weather, but like our weather's not that cool. It is, but it's
not bad.
yeah. But I think it's a little bit about.
Don't get me wrong. I've been stuck in the rain because most of the time I get brought out is in December. But compared to London,
yeah, compared to London, yes. But I think there's like this, like just living experience. Because, for example, I just did this episode for people of Lisbon, and I think the dude that I forgot the name, Steven maybe, is from Scotland. He's going to kill me. I forgot, but but yeah, he's from the UK somewhere, and I think like a little bit of why like nomad people come here and things like that. It's just like. You live slower in Portugal. It's like we have more time. Like people are always like, oh, you have like an hour for lunch. And yeah, like we take time to do things. Like we sit down for coffee. We did like there's like one of the first things people say if you go for like YouTubers living in Lisbon. They're like, oh, I have to learn to sit down for coffee. It's like it's not like a to go thing. And I'm like, is that a issue? And so I think there's like an element around just like that culture of of stopping, of hanging around, of having that communicate that really shift during COVID, right? Because we're trying to stop thinking about career in the sense of we're burning out until we cannot do that anymore, and thinking about how can I improve my quality of life. So that probably helped out. And again, it's just we have a lot of talent. We have a lot of Portuguese developers around the world in like big companies. It's just we didn't have enough investment here. So that is one of the big things, right? It's like you have talent and there's nothing there. Let's move.
Well, I think it's interesting because I know that Berlin had a period of time where, in fact, it still is one of those cities that attracts a lot of talent to it. I think we've seen Barcelona starting to rise in the same way, and I think Lisbon is the other one that seems to be getting kind of the hot spot. And I think it's fascinating that that's the case, given something like Helsinki, where there's so much demand for talent. And yes, it's cold, but it's not. I don't know what it is. I think it does attract a lot of talent. I love going to Helsinki. I have to say, it's no issue to me at all. But I do think it's interesting how we've seen these other territories. Maybe because there isn't the big hitters, there is space to grow. Mm-hmm. There is space to kind of. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are big hitters in Berlin, but but you get my drift.
Yeah, I think especially in terms of what the industry is looking right now, right? Because it's like, yeah, it's not about having space to grow in the market itself, because the market is always global, doesn't matter where you are. Always but where you are located matters for community, matters for talent, matters for growing the company itself, and like support that it can have from local governments and things like that. So I think the competition, it's a lot more about sustaining companies and less about just like market or clients or whatever that is, or finding gamers, because that you can do from whatever the place you are in the world.
And yeah, I mean, I as a remote worker anyway, I've spent like, basically I've been remote since 2011. I've been traveling around, and it doesn't matter where I am in the world, as far as I'm concerned. As long as I have an internet connection, I'm functioning and I'm in the office. That being said, I mean, I won't make. I can make some cheap Brexit jokes, but I'm not going to. I think being surrounded by people who are creative, fresh, different, interested in other people is a really fascinating thing, and I think that's why I love traveling around and connecting with people.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Oh,
yeah,
sorry. I was just going to say that what you were describing before about like different regions in the UK trying to push forward activities and events. So, for example, I just wanted to put the note that, of course, we're talking about Lisbon as the main city, and yes, we don't have like too much things happening. We have Lisboa Games Week. You have Game Dev Camp. You'll have the meetups that we do like once a month, or sometimes skipping one or other. But also Porto have their game dev meets happening there as well. You have nearby in Barcelos a game dev week there. So there, I see a lot of like schools, for example, trying to do like a big day or like a big collection of days from inviting one or two international speakers to be there. So schools are kind of driving a little bit of event type things. One of the big things is we have global game jams happening in almost every school in the country that has a game dev course. And now Madeira and Açores are our islands. They are starting to see investment in games and trying to do more events around that. So again, it's slower, and it seems like even like how can you guys not have like more things? But definitely it's not about just like one city. Portugal as a country is trying to move in that direction, but it's hard. Yeah.
No, totally. And actually, you maybe reminded me about Marco and Red Cat Pig.
Yeah.
And it's yours, and I mean that's a classic example of a great team working, making a great game out in that territory. I mean, I think this is the point, isn't it? That game makers are everywhere.
Yeah.
All we need is an internet connection and a reasonably decent computer, and we can produce incredible things that hopefully people will adore and love, and we can make enough money to be able to make the next one. That's the kind of way I look at it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think having a different approach to business that we had. So I don't know how you can tell me how it is in the UK on that sense, but I think in Portugal there's still like some afraid of failure in this sense. And I think game, especially if you are for the indie space, it's more than natural to create something that might have to have hype and then you release and then you cannot move forward with it, or your studio goes down and you start another. There's a lot of those trade-off, right? Or like you have like a brilliant student game but then it doesn't go anywhere. And I think we need to teach our younger generations that though this is just like normal steps in the industry, and they will make you as an individual, as a developer, grow and moving forward. And it's okay to like to fail at like the first studio. You will have another. You can grow that. You can work at other. Yeah.
I mean, I always go back to Mythbusters. The Mythbusters for me are icons that we should be believing in. There are two phrases. One is failure is always an option.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Second one is the only difference between screwing around and science is writing things down.
Yeah, that's true. That's their motto. Yes.
Those two mottos for me sum up everything about what's great about game dev. If we get it right, we have to accept failure. Failure is how we learn. In fact, Ian Livingston, who just got knighted and released a book about Dice Men, about the history of what the guys did in terms of bringing in that kind of tabletop RPG to the UK. He was on the radio the other day, and he talked about failure is success in progress.
Yeah.
which was quite a nice line as well. But again, there is still a bit of a stigma even over here about failure.
Yeah.
But I think there's enough of us old lags out there who've been there, done that, succeeded at some things, failed at others.
And I have a question for you on that. So
Yeah,
do you, especially about like the writing things down, because that is
yeah.
actually that is like a conversation happening right now in the Portuguese game industry
Oh yeah,
that I would love to go over for which is some sometimes we forgot our own history and you're repeating mistakes because people are not caught up on what happened before. So do you think markets like what you have in the UK or like things people that are a little bit more in front of the industry side, they have that edge because there's things written down about them? Because I think that's an element. Is like for us it's really hard to pass the threshold to normal media, for example, just like to have normal TVs talk about games, the game industry, etc., in a positive light. That's the other one.
yeah.
And then just
We've had all that.
and then even like the rest of the ecosystem, because that is one of the tenets of Game Dev Lisbon. It's the game industry is not about the devs only; it's about the devs, but the business people, the
Yeah,
journalists, the game maker, the content creators, and all of those people together, they make our industry exist and
yeah.
flourish. And I think that didn't exist in the same way a few years back, and so there's like less things written down about less like recordings. Now we have like a museum, the Spectrum Museum in Portugal. We have like things starting to move forward on that sense, but I think forgetting our history sometimes make us not push forward faster.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean we've had lots of issues with how we're presented as an industry, a
Mm,
lack of understanding. I think that there is now starting. Well, in some areas there has been progress.
mhm,
The fact that we've got someone like Ian getting knighted is fantastic
mhm,
because there's a recognition. There have been a few other, I think Andy Payne. Anyway, a whole bunch of people have had um, recognition publicly. The more important stuff, in some ways, arguably, is that we have communicated with each other more effectively.
mm,
There are a lot of networking events, there are a lot of activities. And I think particularly the arrival of the indie scene, the mobile scene in particular, um, was a bit of a sea change in terms of like how we talk to each other. Because
mhm.
when you're in the bigger organizations, you talk to other people in the big organization. When you have no other organization, or it's just you and your mates, then you crave the connection with others. And I think that transition from being big corporate companies and then those companies spinning out to
Mhm.
create, a bunch of veterans who then create their own teams, who then hire people. And by the way, they know each other. They're less competitive,
Yeah,
less secretive, and therefore they share a bit more information over a beer or over a burger or whatever else it might be. The key thing I think is there's been, unlike other industries like film and music, I think there's a bit more sense that we're not directly competing with each other in the same way all of the time. It's all
yeah,
about our creative component.
I
And
couldn't
also
agree
games.
with you more.
Hmm.
Yeah, go. No, sorry. So,
No, no.
no, I was just going to say that like I couldn't agree with you more because it's like I always say that to others. It's very rarely that you are competing directly with other studio with another game at the same time, because like if you're making a game similar to other studio like a few years from now, then you're just giving more content to their audience. So then you're just like even collaborating. You can do bundles together and things like that.
Yeah,
If you are doing a completely different genre, then you're doing it's for different audiences. If you're doing things from different platforms, then again you're not competing together. And so I think just like the different avenues that games can be played at and the different ways that you can experience, and that's the difference, right? Because like if you experience a movie on in the movies, at home, on your computer, on your cell phone or TV, you're experiencing the same thing. arguably with different conditions, but it's the same product. And if you experience a game on VR and then on your mobile and then on PC and then on consoles, then you just experience a different game almost.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things about this is that there's a paranoia. Someone's going to copy my great idea. Oh my God, they're going to steal it from me. It's going to be terrible. The fact is, A, no one's going to steal your idea because they've got your own. B, if that's your only idea, get another one. Spend some more time thinking about it because that's going to be important. C, the only time you start getting cloned is if you're successful.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're successful. Yes, it's not great having someone clone your game. Absolutely, I understand that, and that's fine. That's fine. But we're building on the shoulders of giants all the time. There is no unique original idea. I'll give you one of the more controversial opinions I have. Came about the game Threes versus 2048 back in the day. Now Threes is beautiful and amazingly put together, and the team that did it was fantastic and really clever, and I admire them. I could not cope with the game. It was too hard. Whereas 2048 was ridiculous, stupid, a fast mover clone in many ways, but actually I found it a little bit more playable as a throwaway thing. And actually what's really interesting to me about that is they're actually two very different experiences. Very simple changes in terms of game design made the experiences feel very different. I think they are very different beasts. Now, get into commercial whys and wherefores if you like, I don't mind. But I'm just telling you my experience as a player. I paid for, well, what I paid for one through ads and the other one through paying for it. I actually accidentally created a whole mobile industry award for guilty pleasures about this very debate. Long story, very long story. Anyway, back to the kind of reality of it, though. So we've got all that going on. This nuance, this ability to think differently about what we're trying to do, to build in brand value, is what matters. You can't and shouldn't prescribe the process of a game mechanic. I think that's a pretty terrible thing to do, and it's never works anyway. Just all it does is it stops people doing something that players find useful. But instead, cherish your IP, your identity, your branding, your art, the things that you are copyrightable, that are normal to copyright. And I think if you lose players in the immersive lore of your game and the branding and art and style of the game, then you've got so many more vectors to monetize and get value from.
I think that's another very, very important thing, right? It's just like we're moving through this. Again, I come from multimedia, so I heard this from a long time, but it was all the rage before, right? Like, how can we do like these multi-universes? And then like what Marvel is doing and all of that was like all the big things, and now it's like the metaverse. But those ideas of like interconnected ways to market it yourself, to reach different people, etc., always existed. It's just you can't find it.
I mean, how many DC characters have surprising similarities to Marvel characters? Some of which I think Captain Marvel even had the same. There was a Captain Marvel in both worlds, I believe, but different characters.
There's a lot of them. There's like the same characters but in different worlds.
No, I'm sure some DC and Marvel aficionados will hate me for saying that, but I think most of them know that does exist and it's a known thing. But that was a factor that so some of the most interesting characters have come out of inspiration from other sources, and it's not where they start that matters; it's where they end up that matters.
Yeah,
in my opinion. No, I'm not a lawyer. Although actually, I was asked to be an expert witness on a case in hyper casual games on the use of similar assets. Can't say any more than that. That's a
difficult one. Yeah, but that's I would just say that definitely there's like different sides of the industry that worked in different ways. Like, who am I to say that you you cannot do like great things with just like same assets of everyone else, and at some point there's a limit for how can you do a low poly thing, right? Because it is a low poly tree. There is not much where else you can go with, and yeah, and but the uniqueness about games is that you have, as you said, music and sound and art and animation um, and gameplay and all of those elements together to create that unique thing. And if you just change one, you remember like the example of Angry Birds, for example, like everyone comparing like other games at the time, they had the exact same gameplay, even sometimes the exact game design. It's just like if it isn't like the cute characters that do the things that they do, it doesn't have that huge success.
And it can even be down to the snap, not even anything other than the parameters of how fast the elastic band moved.
Mm-hmm.
Changed so many things about the feel of the game. And I think that intangible quality of game design, which is less about the mechanic but more about the interaction, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
the emotional feel of
it's not about jumping, it's how you jump, right? That's why Thomas is Alone was just such a precious game that sorry on that.
No, I mean, I've had lots of fun conversation with Mike over Thomas Alone. I still think his original idea for the opening sequence was just delicious. I've talked about that in the past. I just think,
I was going to say one thing connected to what we're describing about like the different just like the different industries, right? So I completely agree, like that networking element and like the sharing of opportunities, the sharing of ideas, and then not be afraid of people stealing those ideas. But I'm also thinking that embracing these different types of games that we're discussing as valid games, and the different type of people that have those experiences is another big element of diversity that is going to impact how games are being made in the future, and then different markets coming into play.
Well, I think it's an interesting way of turn of phrase you use there. So, valid games. It's an interesting one because there's a number of different ways of looking at that particular angle. So, one of the things that I like to go into, because I'm a nerd, is I like to argue that Monument Valley is not a game. No, don't get me wrong. It's brilliant, and I love the team, and they are awesome. But it's a puzzle. Now, nobody on the planet cares other than me. And the reason I care is because I think autonomy is a defining characteristic of a game. Now, that's not the kind of debate I think you mean by a valid game.
Well, but it's a little bit in the sense that, okay, what I think is definitely, again, from where I started, which is not that many years ago, and so you will have a little bit more of that experience. But the conversation around what games are and what paths into the industry existed was completely different from right now. Even if you just, again, now you have VR, now you have blockchain, now you have now you have the metaverse things, now you have whatever that's like the new branch of things, and then like mobile games. I remember, when I started, like free to play was like, oh, what is this? Free to play is going to ruin games, and now they're just like a entire section of what it means to think about games.
People still believe that free to play is ruining games, and it's the biggest thing on the planet. 78% of, in fact, 78% of all revenue in games is service based. Now that's not all free to play, but it's mostly. And mobile, which is predominantly free to play, is bigger than everything else combined.
I keep saying that too, especially to students, or like, even the other day I was doing like a women in games panel, and there was like this kid talking about it, and we were like, okay, if you're discounting, because especially for women, right, whenever you use the the statistic. Now it's different because there's statistics just across platforms. But whenever the statistic was, oh, there's 50% women and men players totally, and then people like, yeah, but it's because you are counting mobile, for example, or like something like that. And they're like, yeah, well, if you don't want to count mobile, then you need to stop saying the industry is like $1 billion industry.
Precisely.
It's
Stop
like if you
cherry
want to
picking.
the 70% of people that are bringing the money, then you need to stop. If you don't want to count those players, then you don't get to count that revenue.
And I suppose the thing is, I often quote things, and I might get it wrong sometimes. I might misremember it sometimes, but I'm actually genuinely interested in what the data actually is. I'm quite happy to change my opinion and views based on how the data changes. I think at the end of the day, that's one of the key things that we've really transitioned in terms of the last 10 years at least, where we suddenly realized, actually, do you know what? We can capture data in ways and detail that no other media can. We can know what people do and feel because we watch their choices in gameplay. And that, I don't mean, I'm not talking about creepy, nasty stuff at all. Far from it. Genuinely just, oh, look, if we look at the array of players in general, we see these average behaviors. No individual pointing fingers. Absolutely not. Don't want to do that. That's wrong. But what we do want to know is, how do we move people? How do we drive their emotions? Because we're trying to tell stories. We can do that in ways that no other platform can do. And that can allow us to make better games. But it also means that if we can then time the moment we want to offer you something you can upgrade to, or use of an ad, in ways that are meaningful and not sleazy, we can actually make better experiences than you would have done. That, I mean, my classic example is always Dark Souls, where had you given me the chance to watch an ad to keep a save point, or maybe even spend $1 to have a save point, I would have spent thousands of dollars in that game.
Yes.
And instead, I stopped playing, not because I didn't like it. I love it. I can't do it. I don't have the skill required. I would probably get there, but I just don't have the time to get there. And that to me is the point. It's like, I appreciate there is a joy in pure skill. Fantastic. You play that game. I want to play a different game. If you make me pay up front, I can't play that different game.
That just goes to what we were describing before. There's like about this competitivity, because it's like, again, you can have like the exact same game with a different monetization model, and that is a different game. Again, I think that's the beauty of game making, right? Because that's what we're describing. That's why we love games, because it's just like you change one element of it, and that element doesn't need to be like game assets or whatever. It can be monetization model. It can be the way you stop the player from playing because it's like, oh, it's already your time. I think what Before Your Eyes did, for example, is very good, because it's like the timing of that game is so particular, because it's like maybe an hour of gameplay right before you get to the end, and it's like it couldn't be more than an hour because my eyes were killing me. I was just trying to keep them open the best I could, and it's just that, right? You're just changing the way you're interacting with the thing, changes the entire scope, for example, because like it couldn't be longer, because then you're just killing your player of tired.
But I mean, let's bring it back to the kind of the where we started. So I think what we're saying is there's a universality to play, and there's different territories, different locations have different heritages of game development, storytelling, and because the UK was one of the earliest locations where gaming was a big thing, because we happened to be historically we've been a fairly kind of affluent environment. Let's not get into that right now. I can get very political very quickly. But because of that kind of context, it's been relatively straightforward for us to have a fairly blooming established industry. And we've got organizations like Yuki and Tiger who've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that we're seen and recognized at government level. We do have video games tax relief. We have a whole bunch of investment communities and stuff like that. So there's a really good established base. Could be improved, of course. There are lots of issues I have with all that. Fine, but I think what you're highlighting is that, I mean, and I don't think Lisbon is behind the curve at all compared to some of the environments, but you are more up and coming, arguably, over the last let's say 8 to 10 years. But it sounds like that context has been a really big opportunity for people from the UK and various other territories to go and start seeing how you can develop that talent and develop more capacity.
Even right now, because of the war and everything else, there's like a few studios from Ukraine setting shop over here. And again, I definitely the government side of things and that push, I think, is a big element that just pushes the entire industry forward. I think while there's discussion on both sides, people that think, oh, if you are a business, you should do that without government. The side that just says, well, if you don't have that support for companies to get established, then you're not competitive in a world environment.
Exactly.
And that is the edge that we're missing. But for me, and I need to do a talk on this eventually, because I'm a strong believer of community driving industry. I think community is not just about like the feel good get together, we're like drinking cups and we're talking video games and you're doing like these very indie things, because it's like if community is established in that way, that, as you said, it's like the studio, their leads know each other, they are engaged, they know their talent, and they are hiring there, and they are talking together like, oh, I had this money that I cannot use. Oh, you have this project that seems nice. Oh, do you want to connect? And do things together? And I think there is something that for some time escaped us. I think I can be unfair again, because I'm standing in the shoulders of giants as well. I'm standing here because of a lot of people that believed in me before and created the events where I was, and I met people like you, and I was able to interact. But there was this trust of developers as a whole, of groups of people getting together, of who is these organizations, of maybe we are doing their, because it is so hard to do things. We are a little bit protective of that, because it's like, oh, I worked so hard all by myself, I don't want to share that with anyone else.
Don't have my space.
Yeah. and I think that is something that is a passion of mine for sure, that it is one of the most important things, to show that doing work for others helps you as much as it will help everyone else. Because if you move forward, if you get opportunities, then the entire industry is going to follow. That's why I created the awards. It's like, I couldn't get any. I was so sad. I was like, they're so cute, I want an award. But it's like, yeah, but if I do that for others, like, people are going to write about this. People are going to show about that. They can go to their, for example, the studio from Couvien, which is like a really small town 3 hours away. And they could go there and they're like, oh, we're going to be on the front of the newspaper for sure, like the local newspaper, because like we won another award. And those little things are the things that are going to move us all forward.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of brings us full circle, where when you're talking about kind of Game Dev London, Game Dev Lisbon, we're talking about organizations who are trying to help provide a framework, a community experience where we can share our knowledge, and everyone flourishes when we talk. I mean, I think that's the thing that's always struck me, is the more we connect, the more we share, the more we talk to each other, the best chance we give each other. And I think I love the fact that well, it made me smile when you turned up in the Discord channel, because it was like and I think that's one of the fun bits about being I think in our position, where we've been able to go and meet lots and lots of game developers in lots of different spaces. When we get to connect with each other, I just realize how small the world is, and how much we have to look after each other. With that in mind, I think we're out of time. So, Mafalda, how should people get hold of you? Are there any particular things that you want them to know about?
Okay, so if you want to follow me, you can search online for Somewhat Mary, and I think I'm the only one that you guys are going to show up. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, all the social media. You can follow Game Dev Lisbon. It's gamedevlisbon.com and Game Dev Lisbon Twitter, Instagram, all the other places. And I'm going to be here, Game Dev Lisbon podcasts, hosting future talks. So excited for that. Very excited. Yeah.
I can't wait. I'm sure you'll do some amazing stuff, and I'm sure we'll have another conversation about 15 other like we always do in person.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll make it all work. And anyway, this has been your Game Dev London podcast. I've been your host, Oscar Clark, and we'd love to have you here. If you've enjoyed this, if you found it useful, then please feel free to like, subscribe, and do all the usual podcasty things. Again, make sure you check us all out, and there are plenty of other podcasts that are oncoming, and that will be it. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was enjoyable. Thank you.